I'm I'm starting recording because I wanted to get a couple concepts out before we left tonight. Um, the first, and these are from Richardson and Boyd. The first is about the difference between evoked versus epidemiological culture. So epidemiological, epidemics, people catch germs. In this case, it's information passing among individuals. Evoked culture is more of an evolutionary psych idea. It's when the environment calls up genetically primed or determined behaviors or beliefs. Again, so the evoked culture idea is an evolutionary psychology idea, Cosmides and Tooby. Again, it's that different cultures tap into sort of modules, ways of thought that are hardwired into our genes. An example is like Noam Chomsky's innate universal grammar, the idea that that we have hardwired grammatical rules that allow us to learn language quickly, no matter what culture we're in. Um, and there are some good, or at least interesting examples. Um, so one is the very general belief in ghosts and spirits in many, many different cultures. So the Fang people in Cameroon have a complex system of beliefs in ghosts. They are malevolent. You know, they aim to do you harm. They can pass through objects. Um, and the idea of ghosts or spirits are shared among many cultures. So, for example, you know, Western cultures' belief in angels. Um, there was it was I feel like it was more of a fad 30 years ago. But there was a period where there was like just a ton of TV shows. You know, before vampires, it was angels. Um, and um, the interesting thing is that the an argument is that these shared beliefs in sort of inanimate objects with sentience, with awareness and motivation, is a result of um, the general ability for us to have like a theory of mind. In other words, the the ability that humans have to recognize other humans as independently thinking creatures with their own motivations that we have to suss out um, is, first of all, it's an interesting understanding that you can see developmentally. In other words, in very young children, if you have very young children or siblings or you know that you babysat for, you might have recognized that they think you can see inside their head, right? Really the difference between you and them is a little bit fuzzier than it is in us as adults. Um, and it's believed, suggested, I buy it, that our that the fact that we're able to recognize other individuals as beings with their own sentience, with their own motivations and interests that we have to figure out if we're going to successfully interact with them leads to all sorts of different cultures having beliefs in ghosts and also the human tendency to anthropomorphize inanimate objects. In other words, like your car, you think your car hates you, or you think your car has a personality. Um, and so that might well be an example of, you know, sort of different cultures evoking a sort of built-in or hardwire ability that is general to humans. Okay. Um, Richardson and Boyd, in contrast, argue that most human culture is not like cultures tapping into genetic stuff that's hardwired in, but that it's epidemiological. information, beliefs that get transferred or copied or imitated, but they get passed from one or taught from one individual to another. Um, and some of that is just based on the variation, complexity and difference among human cultures. So if you think of human culture, cultural variation in baboons versus humans, we mentioned this before. In baboons live in different habitats: hot lowland forest, cool highland forest, savanna, and desert. But humans live in all those environments, and alpine mountains, and the Arctic, um, and boreal forest. So the range of variation in habitats is much wider. Yes, so please just shoot me an email. I'll get 8 emails and that'll be great. Um, Food range. Um, Baboons eat a variety of plant foods supplemented with insects, eggs, and small prey. Human variation in food is, an order of magnitude wider, and the variation in preparation, different kinds of cooking, different kinds of detoxification, all those things, much, much, much wider. Group size: baboons can vary. In the savanna, you have 30 to 70 individuals in multi-male and multi-female groups. Highlands sometimes have smaller single male groups. And then West African forest baboons are larger groups that split and then rejoin of a few hundred. Humans have everything from, family groups and small tribes up to nations with 330 million or 1.4 billion, right? So the range of group size is much higher. So the level of cultural variation is much, much higher in humans. Um, So this little flow chart sort of shows another range of variation for epidemiological. So this is all epidemiological now, just knowledge that's being passed on from one individual to another. But cultural knowledge can be passed on vertically. This is unbiased transmission. That means from parents to children. So unbiased transmission is vertically. And then cultural beliefs knowledge can also be passed on um, horizontally, biased, and this is called biased transmission. So all adults in an area might influence share learning with young adults, who then presumably are fixed as adults. And the relative importance of vertical versus biased transmission in this context will affect how important natural selection is versus just what kinds of ideas spread more easily, right? Because natural selection is important if the way that cultural ideas spread is by the parents with better working behaviors get a fitness benefit, have more children, and then that will lead to, you know, a cycle. If bias transmission is really important, then to understand how cultures change, we have to understand, like, why do people imitate certain rules, not necessarily what are the fitness consequences of those rules. Okay, so horizontal versus vertical transmission is the other way of thinking of biased and unbiased. So vertical, remember, is unbiased. So there, it gets somewhat frustrating and unclear because there's two meanings of bias. Bias can be horizontal, But biased can also, thank you, but biased can also just mean that some ideas we're more likely to accept some ideas than others. So the other definition of bias is bias, preferential use of some sources more than others, preferential learning of some behaviors or beliefs. Um, and so then when we're thinking about how cultures evolve for Richardson and Boyd, we have to think about, basically what processes are similar or analogous to genetic evolution. So the source of genetic variation is mutation. The source of um, cultural, new cultural ideas is actually both mistakes, which is like misremembering, but it's also innovation, which might be much more intentional, right? And directed by, sort of thought, right? So the sources of variation in cultural evolution, I would say, are broader than the ultimate sources of variation in genetic evolution, which is just going to be mutations, random changes. You can absolutely have cultural drift, the same way you have genetic drift. You can have chance events in small populations, and that can be seen by, the ebbs and flows of what are popular names. So my daughter's middle name is Celia, named after her great grandmother. That was a popular name in 1900. It's a pretty obscure old lady's name right now, and that actually adds to its charm. So you can probably have sort of waves, right? Um, anyway, another actually in the Henrik reading for tonight, you have examples of cultural drift, usually due to bottlenecks, right? So a lot of the examples um, of Inuit and other Arctic adapted populations becoming isolated, maybe having a disease that wipes out the older individuals in a group, losing technologies due to random chance, due to a population bottleneck, which is kind of a super intense form of genetic drift. All of a sudden, you've lost the ability to make, a longboat dugout canoe, and you can't hunt seals. You can only fish near the coast, that sort of thing. Um, and then you can have biases in transmission, and that could be the way the evoked culture, sort of Cosmides and 2B people would argue that there are some kinds of ideas that we are much more likely to imitate. We have a bias towards. However, there are other biases that don't depend on a genetic predisposition. Some things are frequency based. In other words, there are strong conformity biases, which is biases to imitate whatever behavior or belief is most common. And sometimes you have the opposite, um, frequency based. Um, and then you also have in well established bias towards models, towards people who are successful or wealthy, or have prestige, and we tend to emulate them, even when they are not experts. So bias transmission can be affected by how clear the benefits are, but they aren't always. So examples of transmission where the benefits are clear is the adoption of hybrid corn in Iowa in the Midwest, where people could see the higher yields in their neighbors and it spread very rapidly. Also, the adoption of sweet potato in New Guinea is another example. Interestingly, some cultural traditions are strong and passed on, even though the sort of adaptive function is not clearly understood by the people doing it. One example is boiling water from unsanitary sources. So there are cultures that boil water, that don't have a germ theory of disease. And however, cultures that do boil water have the idea can spread just because those societies are healthier and going to have, higher reproductive rates. Another example is the cultural evolution of processing in manioc, which is described really well in Henrik. Okay, so this is um, the adoption of hybrid corn, which has much higher yield in the United States. And the main take home is just that people, shortly after becoming aware of that hybrid corn had higher yields, you have its adoption. And the interesting thing is, like, what's the reason for the lag even? Some of it is that the downside of hybrid corn is you can't save your own seed and get the same yields, and that could be part of it. But this is an example of a trait that's passing rapidly through a population. The benefits are clear. The example of manioc processing is really interesting, and partly because, you know, the people who invented safe manioc processing did not know like what cyanide was, and in fact, it's really a little bit challenging to make the link between manioc consumption, unprocessed manioc consumption, and the sometimes, months and years it takes to accumulate some of the serious, like, paralytic diseases that come from long-term chronic cyanide poisoning. So manioc, or cassava, it's what tapioca is made from, is a staple crop in South America, and it was introduced to the Old World, Africa, and then Asia in the 16th century. And it's now, an incredibly important crop in a bunch of different places. Now, what's interesting is that there are chemicals and enzymes in manioc that will form hydrogen cyanide when the cells are disturbed. So basically, you can eat the leaves or the roots, but if you eat them straight, especially grind the roots into a flour, it will produce hydrogen cyanide, which is toxic. Interestingly, you can make sweet manioc. You can grow. There are varieties that have less linamarin um, in them, um, but those are also less well defended against insects and have much lower yield. So in order to safely eat manioc, you have to do a whole lot of things to it. There are sort of multiple processing techniques that work best when done over an extended, like, 3-day period and combined. And so this is in its native range. Um, the Tucanoan people process manioc first by, scraping and grating, and then washing a couple times, boiling, waiting, which sometimes will involve fermentation, and then finally eating. And it's a lot of work processing them this way. And there are probably, like, taste cues that they can use that will be indirectly give cues about how about the state of the manioc. But these were traditions that were passed on, and probably um, evolved because incorporating them. No worries. Have a good night. I'm gonna finish in a couple minutes. Just like 2 more slides. I'm not gonna finish this lecture. Um, Evolved culturally because groups that went through this high degree of complex processing could get rid of like 95% of the cyanide, and then had the benefits of a really easy to grow really easy to grow crop. When it was, as described in Henrik, when it was introduced to Africa, the cultural traditions of processing were not known, or at least they weren't deeply part of different groups' cultures, and and a lot of people got sick and died from manioc. But also over the next century, a lot of the traditions, processing technologies were developed and now are spread, from a top down, from like extension, as well as just that groups that were able to process manioc successfully could get the benefits of a really productive food crop. Um, okay, um, I think that what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm I think I'm going to stop here because it's 9:25 and I shouldn't go till 10. Um, but the main take home is that, which I'm gonna start developing again next week, is that Richardson and Boyd are arguing that a lot of the important differences among cultures exist not because cultures are tapping into genetic programs, but simply because um, information is being taught and imitated, and in particular, that information and cultural beliefs and practices that help groups over time um, tend to become more common, that natural selection can operate on cultural traits just as it operates um, on genetic traits. And we're going to be sort of developing those arguments more over the next few weeks. Um, Next week is going to be split between midterm and a lecture, right? So there's going to be a little bit of both. Um, I'm not 100% sure about the format because I have to sort of take some old tests and then reformat them, but my tests for this class are always a mix of multiple choice and short answer and some matching. Matching is like the easiest questions. Yes, I'm going to send out a review sheet tonight. Um, how much time? I'm not sure. Probably an hour. It's going to look a little bit like the quiz. There are going to be some short answers. It's going to look like the first quiz, not the heritability quiz. Probably about 25. But like I said, the really quick ones are going to be matching two columns. Um, there'll be some multiple choice and there'll be some short answer.